She was born in Vienna, in a palace too vast for childhood, one of 16, an archduchess by birth, a bargaining chip by design. They named her Maria Antonia, but no one called her that for long. Her name was not meant to last, it was meant to be exchanged. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, ruled with iron beneath velvet. She had no time for softness, not even in her daughters, especially not in them. They were currency, each one polished and positioned for alliance. Maria Antonia was no different. She was pretty, yes, and quick with laughter, but her charm was not hers to keep. It was to be sent away. France had called, a marriage to end a war, a bride to sweeten the wound. The Dauphin of France was awkward, gentle, a boy more fond of keys than court. But he was heir, and she was chosen. At 14, she was told. At 15, she was sent. They prepared her like a gift. They powdered her hair, painted her lips, trained her in French and formality, until her tongue no longer belonged to her. Every gesture rehearsed, every smile sharpened. They taught her to laugh with silence, to nod without agreeing, to be adored without being known. At the border, they stripped her bare. Not with cruelty, with tradition. Austrian garments removed, Austrian servants dismissed. Every trace of the girl she had been left behind in a ceremonial exchange. Even her name was taken. Marie Antoinette, they said now, as they dressed her in silks stitched with French expectation. Not a girl anymore, not even a woman, a symbol. She crossed into France between breaths. One country exhaled her, the other inhaled. And as the carriage moved, as the wheels turned over spring-soaked earth, she sat beneath layers of lace and gold, hands folded, spine straight, eyes open, still. She did not cry. She had already given everything she could not carry. Versailles did not welcome her, it observed. The carriage arrived just after sunrise, its wheels silent on gravel soaked in dew. Birds called from the trees, but the palace stood still, vast, gilded, waiting. It did not blink. It never did. Versailles is not a home. It is a theater, and every breath inside it is part of the performance. She stepped out in silence. The dress was perfect. Pale rose silk, diamonds in her hair. She had practiced this moment in mirrors, how to descend, how to smile without smiling too much, how to radiate youth and promise without seeming foolish. Still, the eyes that met her were not kind. Courtiers lined the marble steps, powdered and perfumed, their mouths shaped like greetings, their thoughts already sharpening behind the fan folds of protocol. The Dauphin stood at the top, Louis, 17, shy, soft-handed. He offered his arm with the stiffness of someone who didn't want to be touched. She took it anyway, their fingers barely brushed. He smelled like starch and soap. They walked together through the hall of mirrors, through corridors thick with light and silence, gold on every surface, faces on every wall. She tried not to let her breath show. Versailles was more than a palace. It was a mouth, and she was already being swallowed. They presented her to the king. Louis XV, all velvet and jewels and something tired behind his eyes. He kissed her cheek, said she was beautiful, said she was Austria no longer, and then he looked away. The ceremony began. The court watched her curtsy. They watched her kneel. They watched her speak in French, precise and practiced, her accent still soft at the edges. Everything she did was noted, scored, measured like currency, not because they hated her, not yet, because they did not trust what was foreign. Later, in her new rooms, she stood alone. The ladies assigned to her were strangers, their words polite, their eyes not. The walls were lined with silk, the floors gleamed, and the mirrors, always the mirrors, reflected a girl who did not yet know what she would have to become. Outside, France celebrated. Inside, Versailles adjusted to its newest ornament, and Marie Antoinette took her place on the shelf. They undressed her every morning, not with desire, with duty. 4 women, then 6, then more, each with a title, each with a role, each trained to remove a ribbon as if it were sacred. The robe à la Française, the corset, the shift beneath it, all peeled away in layers like she was something to be revealed, not understood. This was the morning toilette of the Dauphine, a ceremony, not a habit. And Marie Antoinette, barely 15, stood still while they bathed her in warm water and scrutiny. She was not allowed to touch her own body. Not in front of them. They powdered her face until her skin vanished beneath it. They rouged her cheeks in the fashion of the court, bright, false, blooming like fever. They painted her lips, shaped her brows, pulled her hair high in stiff, elaborate constructions until her neck looked longer, thinner, more breakable. It was not about beauty. It was about control. Even her undergarments were handed to her by rank. If a duchess entered, the countess who had just offered the shift stepped back. If a princess appeared, everyone froze. The rules were endless, absurd. But she followed them, smiled through them, laughed sometimes because what else could she do? Her body was not private, not in Versailles. Her every breath was part of the ritual. In the afternoons, she was paraded in the gardens, watched while she walked, while she smiled, while she blinked. Everything a queen did was political, even at 15, especially at 15. She wore gowns that cost more than farmers earned in years, and when they whispered about it, when they began to call her extravagant, she was told to smile more. At night, they waited for her in the bedchamber, not lovers, witnesses, to ensure the royal marriage was fulfilled, to ensure an heir would come. She lay beside Louis, the boy king in waiting, each of them wrapped in silence and formality, the pressure heavy even in their stillness. Nothing happened, not for months, not for years, and Versailles noticed. The whispers curled through the halls like smoke. The Austrians, they said, cannot breed kings. She's barren, she's cold, she's wasting the crown. And through it all, Marie Antoinette smiled, because no one had ever taught her how to scream. He was gentle. That was the first truth she learned about Louis. Gentle, not weak, shy, not stupid. A boy raised in gold, with fingers made for clocks and locks and delicate things that never bled. He could take apart a watch in silence, rebuild it without a sound. But when it came to her, his hand stayed still. He was 17, she was 15, and they were married not by love, but by history. He did not look at her the way the courtiers did. There was no hunger in his gaze, only confusion. Only fear, maybe. The weight of the crown hovered above him like a sword, and he already knew it would fall. On their wedding night, they lay side by side like strangers in a painting. The sheets between them remained smooth. The silence between them grew louder with every breath. No one had told them how to be together. Or if they did, neither had listened. He spoke softly, when he spoke at all. Asked her about music, about horses, about the Austrian winters she missed. He listened when she answered, always, as if he were collecting her voice in pieces, storing it somewhere. But he did not reach for her. She did not know how to reach back. He preferred solitude, hunted alone, ate quickly, spent hours in his workshop, building things only he understood. He was not cruel. Not unkind, but his kindness was distant, like candlelight in a far room. She was not what he expected, and he was not what France had demanded. The court began to notice. There was no heir, no child, no blooming of the royal line, and the whispers curled in through every corridor. She was too frivolous, he was too dull. She laughed too much. He desired nothing. Together, they became a problem Versailles could not ignore. She tried. In her way, she wore silk with purpose, let her perfume linger. She touched his wrist once, gently, during a carriage ride. He flinched, apologized, and then said nothing more. They were king and queen in waiting, tied together by ceremony and politics, but they were not lovers, not yet. Not ever, perhaps. Just two children, trained for everything except each other. The king died slowly, not with drama, but with decay. Louis XV, once the beloved, once the magnificent, sank beneath the weight of his own indulgence. His body rotted before the crown left his head. The air in Versailles turned thick with perfume to mask it, but nothing could hide the truth. The old world was ending. She stood beside Louis when the news was whispered, not in a proclamation, but in a breath. Le roi est mort, the king is dead, and then, almost as softly, Vive le roi, long live the king. Louis XVI did not speak. He turned to her with pale eyes and trembling lips and said, Dear God, guide us. We are too young to reign. And he was right. They were 20. They were unready. And yet, the crown did not wait. It was placed upon him not like a reward, but like a sentence. The court shifted instantly. They bowed lower. Their voices changed. Their eyes sharpened. Power had moved, and it had landed on two shoulders too narrow to bear it. She became queen that same moment. No ceremony, no triumph. Just the quiet closing of one chapter and the terrifying stillness of the next. Her rooms changed, her title, her responsibilities, but not the fear in her chest, which only grew. They dressed her in mourning, then in majesty. She stood at the head of a kingdom that already distrusted her, an Austrian, a foreigner, a child. France had wanted a goddess, and now they looked at her as if she were a mistake. Louis ruled gently, too gently. He issued reforms without teeth, spoke in circles, let ministers lead him, then dismissed them when the court disapproved. He tried to do good, but trying is not ruling, and she tried too. She sat through councils, listened, smiled, tried to be French enough, quiet enough, regal enough. But the court found fault in everything. She was too cold or too bold, too silent or too loud, too visible or too absent. The crown sat on her head like ice, beautiful, heavy, and unyielding. And beneath it, the girl from Vienna began to disappear. She built it out of longing, not stone and marble like Versailles, but soft things, green things, a garden tucked away behind hedges and silence, a palace without politics, Le Petit Trianon. They gave it to her as a gift, but she made it into something else, a refuge. At Versailles, she was watched. Every breath, every blink, measured and interpreted. She couldn't laugh without it being written down, couldn't choose a ribbon without it being criticized. But at Trianon, she could vanish. She wore linen instead of brocade, let her hair fall loose, played shepherdess in cotton gowns, yes, but not to mock the poor, not to insult, only to feel something simpler, something real. She fed chickens, she planted roses, she rode without a parade. For a few hours each day, she was not the Queen of France. She was only Marie. The court mocked it, called her frivolous, accused her of playing peasant in silk slippers. But they didn't understand. Versailles was a prison dressed in gold. Trianon was air. It was freedom without fear. And freedom, for her, had never been allowed. She invited only a few, friends who didn't need her crown to respect her, musicians, painters, poets. They talked of philosophy, of beauty, of lives they might have lived if they'd been born far from thrones. It was a world apart, intimate, controlled, safe. But France does not forget its queen, and the people who starved in cities and fields heard only rumors of perfumed gardens and milkmaid costumes, of foreign accents and wasted coin. They called her extravagant. They named her the Austrian woman, Madame Deficit. And still, she returned to Trianon, because it was the only place where her smile was hers, where her laughter wasn't currency, where she could walk barefoot through morning dew and not hear the weight of a nation behind her. But gardens don't stop storms, and the flowers she planted could not silence the hunger growing beyond the gates. The name reached her like a whisper wrapped in poison. Madame Deficit. She read it first in a letter, the words underlined in ink that smelled of damp paper and spite. Then she heard it in the salons of Paris, on the tongues of merchants, on the breath of pamphlets that fluttered like crows through the streets, a queen with empty hands and endless jewels, a foreign girl spending France into hunger. It wasn't true, not all of it. The debt belonged to the wars, to generations of kings who built palaces and armies like boys stacking cards. But it didn't matter. The people wanted a face for their suffering, and they chose hers. The dresses, the diamonds, the powdered hair that scraped the sky, they became symbols. It didn't matter that she wore what they told her to wear, that the gowns were tradition, that the jewels were crown property. The truth had already been sold to the crowd, and it sold well. She smiled through it. At court, at dinners, at the opera, she played the part they resented. Because what else could she do? They hated her for luxury, but would have mocked her for modesty. She could not win, so she danced. They said she had lovers, dozens, ministers, guards, foreign princes, women. It was easier to call her a whore than a woman under pressure. Easier to curse the queen than to look at the crumbling bones of empire. She stopped reading the pamphlets, but they kept coming. Louis tried to help. He lowered bread prices, cut royal expenses, but it wasn't enough. The people didn't want frugality. They wanted blood, and her silence only made them angrier. Because when the mob looks up and sees a face behind glass, it doesn't matter whether that face is kind. It matters that it's dry when they're wet, fed when they're starving, dressed in silk when they're clothed in desperation. So she became a symbol, not of power, not of monarchy, of blame. She lived among mirrors. They were everywhere, in the halls, in the salons, even in her bedchamber, gold-rimmed, ceiling high, polished so perfectly they caught not just reflections, but whispers. Versailles was built to see itself, to adore itself, to trap you in the image of what you were expected to be. And Marie had learned how to be beautiful in all directions. She rose each morning to ceremony. 10 women waited to dress her, another 5 to prepare her hair. Each touch was delicate, each word rehearsed. The rouge was perfect, the lips painted into soft betrayal. Nothing was hers, not the silence, not the body, not the hour. She smiled anyway, because it was safer than falling. Every evening the court assembled around her, the music, the wine, the diamonds that caught candlelight like fireflies. It was magnificent, it was relentless. To the outside world, she was drowning in luxury. To her, it was something colder, something tighter. A cage perfumed with violets and power. She laughed when she was expected to. She danced with the men they whispered about. She nodded to gossip as if it didn't matter, and sometimes it didn't. Not until she was alone. And that's when it became unbearable. Alone in rooms too large for rest, she would sit by the window and listen to Versailles breathe, always awake, always watching. She could hear it behind the walls, behind the silks, France murmuring her name like a threat. Madame Deficit, the Austrian, the queen of nothing. Even her children were not her own. They were watched, touched by strangers before they were touched by her. Their footsteps echoed in hallways where guards always stood. Even when she held them, even when they slept against her shoulder, she could feel the eyes pressing in. There was no softness, only the illusion of it. And through it all, she stayed beautiful. Because if she cracked, if she let the sorrow show, Versailles would not forgive her, and neither would the country she had never truly belonged to. So she became her own mask, and wore it so long she almost forgot what her real face felt like. She laughed too easily, that's what they said. At court, in the gardens, in the theater she built at Trianon, her laughter rang out like silver, clear, musical, effortless. But that was the point. It had to be effortless, because effort in Versailles smelled like fear, and fear was never forgiven. So she laughed. When the courtiers flattered her with clumsy grace, when the ministers stumbled through small talk, when Louis made a joke that wasn't quite a joke, she tilted her head, smiled just enough, and let laughter spill where silence would have cracked the air. She wasn't a fool, she was a mirror, and Versailles needed joy reflected back at it. She gave them what they needed. Behind the mask, it was quieter. She created little performances, private plays in her theater, small concerts, midnight games with friends who didn't ask her to be a queen. Just Marie, just a woman trying to breathe. She dressed in shepherdess gowns and played at simplicity, not because she was mocking the poor, but because it was the closest she could come to innocence. Of course, they didn't see it that way. Outside the palace walls, pamphlets painted her as decadent, wild, unfaithful, a woman laughing while France starved. They said she gambled, drank, ruined men. They gave her 1,000 lovers. They gave her none of her pain. Her laughter, they decided, was cruelty. But they never saw her after the candles burned out. They didn't see her sitting at her dressing table, fingers trembling as the rouge was wiped away. They didn't hear her asking the mirror if she was still enough, still young enough, still beloved, still safe. Because in Versailles, love could be given. But it was never given freely. She knew that, and so she laughed. Because silence was too honest, and crying was not permitted. It began with a necklace, not a word, not a war, a necklace. A tangle of diamonds too extravagant for reason, over 600 stones, strung together for a queen who never wanted them. Not her, not truly. The necklace had been crafted years before, intended for Madame du Barry, the king's last mistress. But she was gone, and the diamonds remained, unsold, unworn, waiting for someone to destroy. And the court chose Marie. She had never touched it, never asked for it. She turned it down when it was offered, twice. But that didn't matter, because there were those who saw her beauty and imagined hunger behind it, who saw her silence and imagined guilt. And all it took was one clever thief, one forged letter, one lie spoken in candlelight. A cardinal was tricked into believing she wanted the necklace in secret, that she loved him, that she would reward him, that she would meet him in the gardens and smile in the dark and slip the diamonds around her throat. The forged letters were filled with charm and promise, enough to make a man believe anything, even love. He purchased it for her. He never saw her wear it, because she never did. The scam unraveled, as all such things do. The thief was caught, the letters exposed, and the court turned instantly, not toward the criminal, but toward the queen, as if she had planned it, as if she had whispered the fraud into being from behind her fan. She was innocent, but Versailles doesn't believe in innocence. The scandal stained her like wine on silk. The people didn't care about the details. They cared about the image. Marie Antoinette dripping in jewels while children starved in the streets. The necklace became a noose braided from glass and myth. It was never about truth. It was about resentment, And this time she could not laugh it away. She never followed fashion, she led it. Paris watched her like it watched the stars, distant, beautiful, impossible to touch. Whatever she wore, the world copied. Gowns with 20 yards of silk, hats taller than her thoughts, hair sculpted into ships and gardens and powdered skies. She was not just a queen, she was the performance, and she performed it well. Even when her body ached, even when her heart was silent, she showed herself radiant, gowned, corseted, lips brushed with the faintest rose. Every appearance was armor, every ribbon a message. They called her extravagant, they called her divine, and she let them. Because anything was better than letting them call her weak. She built herself in fabric and form. Her seamstresses were her secret army, her designers her shield. She changed with the seasons, with the rumors, with the growing tension in the streets below. When they said she spent too much, she switched to muslin. When they mocked her height, she stood taller. When they whispered she was aging, she dazzled them in white, untouched, like a statue with breath. But the applause began to change. The whispers grew crueler. Every dress was a debt, every gem a betrayal. It didn't matter that others at court spent more, that the king's brothers gambled fortunes in a night. Her beauty was no longer an asset, it was a threat. They called her heartless, vain, a peacock while France burned, but they still watched, still stared, still begged to know what she would wear next, what she would do, how she would fall. Because even as they turned against her, they could not look away, and she knew it. So she stood straighter, wore silver, smiled. If they were going to hate her, they could do it while admiring the cut of her gown. For once they cheered. The bells rang out across Paris, not for war, not for a wedding, but for a birth. An heir, a boy, a child wrapped not in silk, but in salvation. The queen had done her duty. France had a dauphin, and for a moment, just one, they loved her. She gave birth in public, not by choice, by tradition. The chamber was crowded, courtiers, physicians, ministers, women watching from behind fans, men pretending not to look. She screamed once, sharply, then again, and they all heard it. The pain was not private, the blood not hidden. Her body had been on display since she was 15, and now even her agony belonged to the crown. But when they placed the child in her arms, she forgot all of it. He was small, perfect, alive. Louis Joseph. She held him close, and something in her face softened, a line smoothed, a breath deepened, not as a queen, not even as a wife, as a mother, the first thing she had ever been without ceremony. Louis stood beside her, smiling, not the awkward smile of a boy fumbling with power, but the quiet one of a man who had waited for this moment longer than he ever said aloud. He kissed her forehead. She let her eyes close. And for a few months after, the court changed. They bowed lower, spoke sweeter. The newspapers wrote her name with less poison. Even Paris, that restless, angry heart, seemed to hold its breath. The queen had given France its future, but peace, like perfume, fades. The people wanted more. The court returned to its whispers. Her every move still watched, still judged, and the child, beloved as he was, could not protect her from what would come next. Still, she had that moment. The morning sunlight across the nursery, the way he wrapped his tiny fingers around hers, the scent of milk and clean linen, the sound of his breath, slow and soft against her neck. Not everything she touched turned to ice. Not everything she gave was stolen. The streets began to crack. Not the stones, the silence. It started with whispers, soft and bitter, then footsteps, then fists. In the alleys of Paris, men no longer asked for justice. They asked for bread. And when none came, they asked for blood. The price of flour had risen. The harvests had failed. The winters stretched longer, colder. Mothers boiled roots, then leather, then nothing at all. And through it all, Versailles sparkled. The fountains ran clear. The music never stopped. That was the cruelty, not the gowns, not the jewels, the silence. Marie heard it in letters at first, from ministers too careful, friends too vague. Then in the stilted conversation at court, no one spoke plainly, but their eyes moved differently. Their glances lingered longer on the doors, the windows, the shadows. She began to wake in the night, not from dreams, from a feeling, something watching, not a person, but a presence, a pressure growing beyond the gates. Hunger does not stay quiet, not forever. And France had begun to wake with open mouths and clenched fists. She asked questions. She was told not to worry. She asked again. The answers came slower, then stopped. So she stood at the balcony one dusk, the wind tugging at her sleeves, and looked toward Paris. She couldn't see the bread lines, the children with bellies like empty drums, the men with calloused hands and hopeless eyes, but she felt them, like a tide rising under the skin. She thought of her son, his soft breath, his unknowing smile, and she felt afraid, not for herself, for everything she had built her life on. Because the hunger wasn't just for food anymore. It was for change, and it was coming for her. They came in the rain, women, hundreds at first, then thousands, barefoot, soaked, furious. They carried knives, hammers, wooden spoons. They carried children, hunger, silence that had turned into screams. They did not come for spectacle. They came for bread. They came for justice. And they came for her. It began in the markets of Paris, voices rising, hands raised. No flour, no grain, no hope. Someone shouted. Someone else followed. By midday, it had become a march. By evening, it had become something else entirely. They walked 15 miles to Versailles, through mud, through exhaustion, through fury. No music, no chants, only the sound of France arriving. She stood at the window as they gathered at the gates, watched the torches burn against the wet sky. They looked small from above, but she could feel them, could feel the weight of their eyes, even from behind glass. They wanted to see her, not the queen, not the painting, the woman. Louis hesitated. The guards waited. She dressed carefully, slowly, white gown, simple ribbon, no diamonds, not to appease, not to charm, to show them she was not hiding. She stepped out onto the balcony, and the crowd breathed in. Some gasped, some jeered, some fell silent. She was smaller than they imagined, younger, more human. The rumors had made her into something monstrous. But there she stood, pale against the wind, holding her children's hands. She bowed her head, did not speak. Not because she was afraid, though she was, but because words would be wasted. The hunger in their eyes had swallowed language long ago. They demanded she return to Paris. She knew what that meant. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a shield, a wall of mirrors and ritual. But the wall had broken. The distance was gone. She would sleep within reach of the mob now, within reach of their breath, their hands, their rage. She nodded, and the Queen of France stepped down from her stage. They left Versailles at dawn, not in silence. Silence was no longer possible, but in something close to it. A murmur, a tension, the sound of something too large to grieve out loud. The Queen, the King, their children, their attendants, all loaded into carriages while the people watched, thousands of them, lining the roads with their hunger and their breath, pressing in like fog. It was not an escape. It was an escort. At the front of the procession, women marched with pikes, their dresses stained with rain and smoke. Some held loaves of bread like trophies, others held empty baskets. They sang as they walked, not songs of joy, songs that sounded like thunder, full of promise and warning. Inside the carriage, she held her son close. He was too young to understand what it meant to be moved like this, to be unthroned without ceremony, to be watched not with reverence but with the eyes of those who had nothing left to lose. Paris loomed on the horizon by afternoon, and it did not cheer. It stared, no trumpets, no celebration, just the long, low murmur of a city that had opened its gates for a queen it had already decided to hate. They were brought to the Tuileries, not a palace, not really, a structure full of echoes and dust, too close to the street, too far from anything that could protect them. The rooms were cold, the furniture bare. The guards stood inside the halls now, always watching, and Versailles was gone. Its light, its mirrors, its performances, all dissolved into the past like smoke. There were no costumes here. No laughter, no distance, just stone, just windows without drapes, just a woman who had once ruled a kingdom now pacing the edges of a narrow room, asking where the silence had gone. But the silence wasn't gone. It was waiting, breathing, gathering outside the gates of Paris. She waited as long as she could, waited for reason to return, for the air to clear, for someone in power to remember she was still a queen. But Paris did not forget, and Paris did not forgive. Each day in the Tuileries brought new eyes, new guards, new rules. She no longer walked the gardens alone. She no longer touched her letters without permission. The walls leaned closer. So they planned, not rashly, not foolishly, carefully, secretly. Louis hesitated. Of course he did. But she moved with quiet urgency. Every moment of delay felt like another thread unraveling beneath her feet. They would leave, not to escape, to survive. The plan was simple. Carriages disguised, loyalists waiting. A route mapped through the veins of France, pulsing away from Paris. They would ride through the night. They would be free by dawn. It almost worked. The journey began in silence, the children bundled in sleep, the sky dark and open above them. The queen sat stiff in borrowed clothes, her hair hidden beneath a simple bonnet, her hands trembling inside gloved fists. The horses moved fast. The roads were clear, until Varennes, a village, a pause, a moment too long beneath the wrong lantern. A man recognized the king, not the face, not truly, but the bearing, the stillness, the weight that never leaves someone raised in command. Word spread too quickly. They were stopped, not by soldiers, by townspeople, men and women with pitchforks and fear in their voices. The escape unraveled in their eyes. The carriages were turned around, the guards repositioned, and the royal family was carried back, not in shame, but in silence deeper than any they had ever known. Back to Paris, back to the cage. But this time, the locks were heavier. The people did not see frightened parents. They saw traitors. She stood behind glass again, this time not admired but watched. No longer a queen. No longer even a symbol, just a woman who had tried to leave and failed, and the gates of the Tuileries shut behind her with the sound of something ending. The word they used was citoyenne, not queen, not majesty, just citizen. Marie Antoinette heard it first from the guards outside her door. They said it with a smirk, not cruelty yet, but something close, a reminder, a rehearsal of the roles that would soon shift. She did not flinch. She had grown used to new titles. Inside the Tuileries, the air had changed, not just colder, not just thinner, more brittle. Servants walked slower. Ministers spoke less. No one brought her news unless it bled. And everywhere, in every corner of the palace, she could feel the press of eyes, eyes that once bowed now watching for weakness. Outside, France was changing. The revolution moved through the streets like wind before a storm, banners raised, bread still scarce, crowds louder, louder still, words sharpened into names, names into enemies, and always, always her name at the center. No longer just Madame Deficit. Now, the Austrian, the widow Capet, the foreign queen who had tried to flee, the enemy behind the silk. She stopped reading the papers, but the voices found her anyway. They came through the walls, through the chants beneath her windows, through the cold silence of ministers who no longer looked her in the eye. Paris had turned, and it would not turn back. Even Louis felt it now. He spent more time with the children, less time at council. He wrote in his journal at night, but said little to her. She watched him shrink inside his skin, a king only in memory. They spoke in whispers, so the walls would not listen. They made plans again. None of them lasted. The revolution was no longer a question. It was a shadow stretching long across the marble floors, not yet at her feet, but close. Close enough to touch the hem of her gown, close enough to reach for her crown. She had once ruled a kingdom. Now she waited for the knock on the door. They called it justice, but it was theater. The kind she used to watch from velvet balconies, now performed with her as the centerpiece, no longer above the stage, but caged within it. They brought her to trial in a cart, through streets that once bowed and now spat. She wore black, not for drama, for mourning, for silence, for what was already gone. The courtroom was full, men who hated her, men who feared her, men who needed her to fall to prove they had risen. The charges read like fiction: high treason, conspiracy, theft, corruption of the monarchy, corruption of her own son. That was the cruelest. They said she had defiled him. Her child, 12 years old, sick with fear, taken from her arms and coached to lie. They paraded his words like truth, not caring that they bled, not caring that they broke something that could never be mended. She did not weep. She said only this: "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge." The silence that followed was the only honest moment in the trial. They never meant to acquit her. The verdict was written before the questions. She stood for hours, hands folded, spine straight. The queen burned away from her skin, but not her gaze. She did not beg. She did not plead. She did not lower her head. She listened. She waited. And when they pronounced the sentence, death, she blinked once. No gasp, no cry, just breath and stillness, and the long, slow exhale of a woman who had already lost everything but her name. Marie Antoinette, no longer a queen, soon not even a citizen, just a woman with one morning left. He died in January. They took him from her slowly. First his crown, then his title, then the hours he was allowed with his children, and finally the man himself. They called him Louis Capet, not king, not father, just a name unstitched from history. They gave him a trial, too, but not time. He was found guilty of treason, though what treason meant now changed with every sunrise. He spoke before the blade, not as a monarch, but as a man who still believed words could soften steel. They did not. She did not see him die. They would not let her. She heard the cannon instead. One, then silence. That was how Paris marked a death now, with thunder and restraint. No mourning, no bell, no procession. Just a shot fired into the cold morning so the city would know the crown had fallen. She closed her eyes when it came. She did not scream. She did not sob. The guards watched for it, and she gave them nothing. Not because she was strong, but because grief had already hollowed her too deep for sound. She had lost him long before the scaffold. In the corridors of the Tuileries, in the failed escape, in the stillness of their bedchamber. That day, she wore no black. There was nothing left to honor. In the weeks that followed, the walls of her world shrank. The children were taken, the attendants dismissed. The prison thickened around her, stone and breath and shadows that never moved. She dreamed of him once. Louis, not as a king, but as a boy, kind-eyed, unsure, offering her a ring with hands that never learned to hold power. She woke before he spoke. She never dreamed of him again. Outside, France celebrated. Inside, she waited. Now there was no king, only the widow. That's what they called her now. Not your majesty, not madame, not even Marie. Widow Capet, a name stripped of silk, stripped of crown, left bare and ordinary. It echoed through the prison halls like a joke no one dared laugh at. She answered to it because there was nothing else to answer to. Her world had narrowed to stone. No attendants, no mirrors, no velvet, only a small room at the conciergerie, damp with river air, lit by a single window high above her head. The straw mattress sagged under her weight. The walls wept in silence. Her hair turned white before her reflection could confirm it. They gave her a cup, a spoon, a threadbare shift. They took her children. First her son, Louis Charles, her dauphin, was torn from her arms and locked away alone. They claimed to be re-educating him. In truth, they were unmaking him. When they forced him to accuse her, to say she had touched him in ways no mother ever should, he said the words in a voice that no longer belonged to him, a voice trained by hunger and fear. They asked her if it was true. She said nothing at first. And then, quiet as prayer, she spoke. I appeal to all mothers. No one replied. Then they took her daughter, her last one, left only with silence and prayers and the memory of hands she would never hold again. The nights grew long, the candles short, her body thinned, her voice lowered, but she did not bend. She wrote in secret, letters folded with trembling fingers, not to plead, not to beg, but to remain, to leave behind something human, something still hers. And in the echoing dark of the conciergerie, she began to prepare herself, not for freedom, not for forgiveness, but for the last performance, the final unveiling, not as a queen, as a woman who had survived long enough to die on her own feet. They woke her before dawn. No ceremony, no priest, just footsteps in the corridor and the low voice of a guard who no longer spoke with cruelty. By then, even they understood what it meant to escort her to the scaffold. The widow, the mother, the last queen of France. She dressed herself, no ladies to assist, no perfume, no jewels, just a simple white gown, clean, plain, the color of mourning for a queen in France. Her hair had turned pale as frost, her hands thin but still steady. She pinned it back so the blade would not be slowed. She did not ask for mercy. She did not cry. She asked only for paper. One last letter to her sister-in-law, to her children, what remained of them. She wrote with the calm of someone who had already lost everything that could be taken. She wrote of dignity, of forgiveness, of God. The ink trembled, but her words did not. The guards offered to blindfold her. She refused. They tied her hands behind her back, and she walked through the halls, into the cart, past the crowds that once cheered her wedding and now came to witness her death. She did not speak, not until the wheel struck a stone and she stepped on the foot of the executioner. "Pardon me," she said softly. "I did not mean to do it." Those were her last words, not a speech, not a prayer, an apology. At the scaffold, she climbed the steps herself, slowly, without help. She stood straight as the crowd held its breath, not out of respect, but out of something older, the strange stillness that lives in the air when a chapter is about to close. The blade fell. The queen was gone. But for a heartbeat after, Paris was silent. And in that silence, she lingered, white and still, like snow that falls long after winter has ended. Versailles never spoke her name again, not officially, not in ceremony, not in mourning. The halls remained polished, the chandeliers dusted, the gardens trimmed, but her name was erased. The woman who once danced beneath those mirrored ceilings was now a shadow. Yet she lingered, not as a ghost of vengeance, but of elegance. A whisper in silk, a breath of perfume where no one stood. The palace remembered her in details it could not remove. Chair legs scuffed by her heels, faded stitching on a chaise where she once laughed, the smallest fingerprints on glass where she once watched the sunrise alone. They tried to forget. France had moved on. The monarchy collapsed. The revolution devoured its own. But Versailles remembers everything. It was built for memory, after all, built for beauty. And she had been both. Her portrait still hung in private rooms, not the grand halls, not where diplomats met or tourists gathered, but tucked away, in unused corridors, dusty antechambers, the dressing rooms of old maids, paintings of her in lace and feathers, eyes soft, gaze averted, not guilty, not innocent, just human, just young. Visitors still claimed to feel her. A scent, roses and powder, a hush in the room where none should be, footsteps in empty salons, a piano key pressed when no one plays. Not always, not often, but enough. Enough for the story to stay alive. And maybe that's how it should be. Not as a tragedy carved in stone, nor as a villain sketched in ink, but as a question, a presence, a reminder of what power does to women and what silence costs when spoken too late. She lived in mirrors, and mirrors do not forget.